All right, everybody, thank you for coming. I want to welcome you to this Authors at Google presentation with our guest, Aaron Hurst, today. My name is Cord Diamond, and I'm very proud to welcome Aaron to Google today to talk about his new book, The Purpose Economy. I had the pleasure of meeting Aaron in 2005 when I joined the Taproot Foundation, which, Aaron, I believe you started in 2001. And for those of you who don't know, the Taproot Foundation is a wonderful nonprofit organization that really was at the vanguard and continues to be a leader in the pro bono service market. And if you're interested in volunteering for things beyond, general cleanup or supporting soup kitchens and things of that like, and you want to donate your professional experience, I highly recommend you check out the Taproot Foundation, their site, taprootfoundation.org. But when I met Aaron in 2005, it was sort of an electrical moment. You meet him and you just sense this high level of energy from Aaron. He's incredibly bright, very warm, very friendly. But the thing that stood out the most for me was that Aaron is a frenetic thinker. And I mean that in all senses of the word frenetic. It's rapid fire. You get in a conversation with him and just the topics seem to veer left, right, and center. They touch on all sorts of different things and you're kind of left reeling for a moment, wondering where is he going with this? How is he getting from point A to B to C to D so fast? And what I ended up finding out was, an hour or a day or a week later, he'd come back to you and have a conversation about that topic, or he'd give a presentation on something. And what you'd realize is that he was busy connecting all of these dots. He was making connections and dissecting relationships and rebuilding relationships, and he'd come at you with this very clear, on-point, concise presentation of an exposition on what you were talking about. And it was just amazing. It's amazing to see. And it's that attribute of Aaron's that allowed him to foresee the pro bono service market and kind of lay the foundation for that with the Taproot Foundation. And again, he's done something amazing using that skill set by dissecting the difference between cause and purpose, as well as identifying that we're now entering this new economic stage, the fourth economy stage, if we could call it that after the information economy, one that's driven by purpose. And what he's here to talk about today is the purpose economy, how he came to this realization and what it means for us, and how we as individual Googlers and together as Google can participate and help drive this new purposeful economy. So give it up for Mr. Aaron Hurst and the purpose economy.
Thank you, sir. And thanks, Cliff, for putting this together. I'm going to go back and forth here, but it's great to be back in this room. I think I was here maybe 5 years ago talking about Taproot, and excited to be here talking about my new book and new venture, Imperative. But before I begin, I want to explain a little bit about the background of writing this book, because I think it speaks to what you just mentioned, which is I wrote this book in a couple months and was about to publish it and then decided, you know what, I don't like this book enough because it's too much of my book. I want it to be our book. And I got the publisher to agree to print 2,000 copies and send them to 2,000 people in my network, and said, on every page I marked it up saying, do you have a better example? Do you have any other data? Et cetera, and sent it out all around the world, in China, India, all around the world to friends, and got back just reams and reams of feedback. And the book that you see today is actually about 20% the book that was based on my thinking. 80% of it came from getting all this input from people around the world. But one of the pieces of feedback, which was really challenging, was one guy said, "Why are you writing a book no one reads?" Right? And I struggle with what to do about that. It's like developing a car for people who don't drive, or a phone for people who don't talk, et cetera. And the solution came in hiring a cartoonist. You'll see in the book, before each section, there's a cartoon that lays out sort of the summary, so you don't actually have to read the book, because I wanted to be realistic about the fact that most people don't read. Apparently with business books, only 20% of those even purchased ever get read. So hopefully at a minimum you can read the cartoons. And that's me as a cartoon. You'll notice one thing that's anatomically incorrect. Can anybody guess what it is? Seth? Fingers. I actually only have 2 fingers, and there you'll see I have 4. So as Court was saying, I spent a lot of time over the last 5 years trying to look at different patterns, different relationships, different trends, different innovations, to try to figure out what was going on overall in our economy, as I saw Taproot taking off and saw so much change happening from even like 5 or 10 years ago when I used to work in Silicon Valley, and trying to understand like what was the fundamental underlying trend of what we saw. And I came across my uncle's 1978 dissertation when he was an economist at Stanford and coined the term information economy. And he had this 9-volume dissertation, which I honestly have not read because I think you have to go to DC and like find it in the Library of Congress to actually read it. But I was lucky enough to find a synopsis of it. And it was really interesting to see what he had started to see happening 50 years ago, which was a fundamental evolution in our economy. And the best way to understand it is to go back to biology. And you think about how we started off as apes, right? Does anyone here disagrees with that? Okay, so we got one. It was like we started off as dolphins, or? God made us, there it is. So God made us, or we start off as apes, and over millions of years we evolved from apes to humans. It took millions and millions of years. But one thing that defines who we are as humans is we're impatient bastards, right? We're incredibly impatient. We're never willing to wait for anything. And as part of that, we were really frustrated by how slow evolution works. We didn't want to wait another 20 million years to evolve. We wanted to take sort of our own destiny into our own hands. And we started with the agrarian economy, using the land, animals, to increase our life expectancy, increase our quality of life. But again, we grew impatient. And after a few thousand years, we created the industrial economy, where we started learning how to be stronger than evolution would have ever allowed us to be, right? We started to be able to manipulate large amounts of rock and machines to become incredibly strong. But that wasn't good enough either. And what my uncle saw was the start of another era, where we said, we want to hack evolution again. We want to hack it to become smarter and be able to access and manipulate more information, to have relationships with more people, to be able to access content from more places. And the information economy arose basically in the late 60s to become the dominant driver of the American gross domestic product. So we've had this evolution that took millions of years, and then we got better at it. We started taking just thousands of years, hundreds of years, and then more recently, well less than 100 years. And what's interesting about this, and what I really challenge you, if you take nothing else away from today, and you think nothing I say makes any sense to you, the one thing I'd really challenge you with is a question, which is information economy the last stop in our process of hacking evolution? Are we done? If you look at the trend here, it's very unlikely. It is very unlikely that we're done. It's more likely that there is going to be a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. We will continue to evolve and to hack evolution to make it better meet our needs as human beings, right? And it's likely getting shorter and shorter. Just like with Moore's law around computing, we're finding that each of these eras are getting shorter and shorter. And if you look at that on a trend line, it basically means in the next 10 to 20 years, we're likely to see another economy become the dominant economy, not the information economy. And are any of you entrepreneurs or consider yourselves entrepreneurial? So a few of you. So I think as an entrepreneur, it's one of the most exciting questions, which is we've seen so much disruption in the last 50 years, right? In the last 50 years, we've seen almost everything change. We're probably 10 to 20 years away from another change of that order of magnitude happening, and we don't yet have like a clear path on it. And it's an opportunity for the next set of entrepreneurs to really remake every industry based on whatever this next economy is. So I think it's just an important thing to like wrap your mind around. Is there going to be another economy? And if so, based on what you see in the world, what do you think it's going to be? As I looked around and tried to understand the changes I saw happening all around the world, as I traveled in China, traveled in Europe, throughout the US, South America, what was going on? What were the little signs of evolution that were happening? Not just rare, like one-off anomalies, but where did you see real trends happening? And the best way I could come to explain this in a clear way was going back to Psychology 101 and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and looking at the fact that over time, what we've basically been doing is trying to hack each of these levels to become able to be sort of masters of our domain, right? Where we first really focused on biological and physiological needs, and we started moving up to safety needs, et cetera. And as we moved up this, we naturally started focusing on the next one. And as we look at the millennial generation, and you look at what drives the millennial generation, millennials around the world, and this is not true of every socioeconomic class, but those that are really at the forefront of innovation, They're no longer scared of where is my next bed? Where is my next meal? How am I going to survive? The fear is, am I going to have a life that matters? Am I going to have a life with meaning? Does my work matter? It's a fundamental fear of not mattering, of not having made an impact. This is the thing that we're hearing over and over again, and we're seeing innovation around people wanting and being scared of a life without meaning. And it's changing labor, it's changing products, it's changing retail. This fundamental desire to have a life that matters is a thing that is defining this generation. So that, along with a lot of other variables, which I won't bore you with, has really led me to the conclusion that this next economy, this fourth economy, is going to be one driven by man's quest for purpose. Now that we've hacked and become faster, stronger, and smarter, we're now hacking evolution to become human beings again, and to bring meaning and being human nature back to who we are, and hacking all of these great tools we've built so they can actually improve our quality of life on a much more meaningful level. So as Cord said, I founded the Taproot Foundation in 2001 with the goal of making sure that every nonprofit has access to the marketing, technology, HR, strategy support they need to be successful. Because I had worked in the nonprofit sector and knew that these organizations, without those resources, are not set up for success. And so many corporate volunteer programs were not focused on meeting them with what they actually needed. They were just doing the things that were easy, not the stuff that actually made an impact. And over 12 years, we scaled the organization around the world, working with dozens of companies, and really focusing on building a marketplace for this new form of philanthropy, parallel to cash, a marketplace for pro bono services, for human capital, to meet these core needs. I mean, imagine Google if you had no technology, HR, or marketing department, right? It'd be pretty hard to survive. We built this out to the point where when I left Taproot, it was a $15 billion marketplace for pro bono services around the US and then global markets around it, from schools to companies, et cetera. But ultimately, I left because of exactly what you mentioned earlier, which I started seeing a bigger trend emerging, or a more important one, which was that when we talked to people who did pro bono work, this is consistently what we heard. I find pro bono work so much more rewarding than my paycheck job. And at first we were like, hot damn, we did it. We created Disneyland for work, right? We created like the ultimate, funnest, awesomest, most rewarding form of work there is. But then we took a step back and realized we had done just that. We had created a Disneyland. We had created a place that you go and have an amazing time, but when you come back, it's not anything remotely close to Disneyland. And that ultimately the question is not how to create Disneyland, it's how do you make sure what you're doing 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week fundamentally feels more like pro bono work and meets our needs as human beings. We can't continue to take supplements to make up for work that no longer meets the needs that we have as human beings. So my new goal with my new company is no longer how do we make pro bono accessible to every nonprofit. It's a much scarier goal, which is much more exciting, which is how do we make all work feel like pro bono work? How can we radically redesign work so that all work feels like pro bono work? So this sort of raises the question overall of like, what is purpose? What is meaning? Does anyone have an answer? What is the meaning of life? Anyone? 42. That's the answer I got from, I think it was actually someone from Google in Dublin a couple weeks ago. So clearly the Hitchhiker's Guide is doing well in the Google culture. So this is a tough question. And if you look throughout history, back in the day when I was a caveman, we used to stay up late at night, looking at the stars, wondering what the meaning of life was. I was raised Buddhist, and it's one of many religions that spends its time contemplating what is the meaning of life, why are we here, what are we doing? The great philosophers spent most of their time wondering what is the meaning of life. And today, talk show hosts like Oprah spend a lot of time pondering what is the meaning of life. And I have great news for you, which is I have no clue. That is not what I'm talking about today. What I am going to share with you is that in the last 5 to 10 years, scientists have been able to determine to a large degree what is it that actually defines meaning and purpose when it comes to work. Not the rest of your life, but at least when it comes to work, what drives purpose, what drives meaning. And it's been amazing. It's basically a set of researchers from Penn, University of Michigan, and Yale have been behind an incredible, just breakthroughs in this work. I mean, It's much like, I think of it as like when we first were able to commercialize the internet and what that enabled in terms of change in the economy and change in society. This new research is just as breakthrough in my mind in terms of enabling us to understand finally like what actually generates purpose at work. And I'm going to share with you some of those highlights because I think that's really critical to the future. And as Cord said, I think the first thing I struggled with was that I'd been practicing malpractice for about 12 years and giving terrible advice to professionals all around the world about how to find purpose and meaning at work. And it wasn't until I saw the research that I was like, I totally missed the point here. And it was really, really profound for me. And I want to share with you before I define what generates purpose to help you understand some of these myths about purpose that I have been holding and have been giving as bad advice for about a decade. The most important is the myth that purpose and cause are the same thing, or they're even connected. We tend to, like when I talk to someone, like a 22-year-old comes to me and says, I want more meaning in my work, but I can't figure out what my cause is. Is it kittens? Is it dogs? Is it healthcare? Is it wells in Africa? Like I haven't been able to find out my cause. And we tend to think that cause is the thing we need to have a career and purpose, with rich in purpose. This is incredibly prevalent. And the reality is, much like this lady from the Upper East Side in New York, many people have many causes in their lives and no purpose, right? Does anybody know anybody who has a lot of causes? Like they go on Facebook or LinkedIn, they check off all the causes, but they don't really have any purpose? Anyone? Some nods, couple? But similarly, do you guys know anybody who has tremendous purpose in their work but doesn't have a single cause that you could name? These things are not connected. And we can't continue to rely on causes as the way in which we connect with people with purpose. And as I've talked to executives at large companies around the world, I think they're starting to realize that cause marketing, like all these things we've been doing, aren't actually addressing what the core need is. And they tend to be fads, they tend to come and go. People can find purpose in many causes. And having worked in the nonprofit sector, many people at large nonprofits actually do pro bono work at small nonprofits because they don't find any purpose working at a large nonprofit. It's really fascinating that nonprofits don't generate necessarily any more purpose than a company. It's a complete misunderstanding of like the nature of how purpose works. The other two myths are that purpose is a revelation. And this one sounds ridiculous at first, but I'm guessing most of you have this myth in your head, which is that purpose is going to find you. You're going to open up the New York Times, Sunday magazine, read an article and like find purpose. Or that you're going to go to Africa and see someone struggling and be like, I have found my purpose, right? It's amazing how much we think purpose is something that happens to us and comes to us by revelation, right? I was at Oxford a couple weeks ago talking to a bunch of graduate students. It was a wonderful discussion. I shared this research, and they all looked incredibly depressed. And I was like, okay, what's going on here, guys? This is people from all around the world. And they said, without exception, every one of them had gone to graduate school because they thought they would have a revelation about purpose, and that they would graduate with a revelation about what their purpose in their career was. And they had sort of come to the realization through this that, wow, like I'm probably not going to graduate with a revelation. And I think so many of us are sort of waiting for that revelation instead of realizing purpose is within us and that we have to make purpose. We have to create it in our lives, not wait for it to happen to us, not go $150,000 in debt to get an MBA that we think will give us purpose when in fact it's not how we're going to find purpose. And the third myth is that purpose is a luxury. We tend to think that purpose is only for those who can afford it. It's only once you've earned enough money or if you're a certain level of privilege or you're middle class that you're allowed to have purpose. And this myth is most common among middle and upper class folks because they project onto people who are of lesser economic status and say, how could you possibly have purpose if you're poor, right? And it's not meant to be patronizing, it's not meant to be insulting, but it's a lack of understanding of actually, I would argue, often the people with the least means often have the most purpose. Most of the senior execs I know have less purpose than the folks who are at the entry level in most companies. I had the most purpose in my career when I was probably 22. I was actually able to have authentic relationships, do coding myself, do things that actually created a sense of progress. And it's interesting, right over at LinkedIn, we were talking to them the other day, and they were saying how one of their most senior folks just demoted himself 3 levels, because he's like, I get so much more purpose from working as a manager than I did as a VP. And if you think about universities, among academics, it's considered a demotion to make dean, right? Like everyone fights to not be the dean. And yet in companies, everyone's fighting to be the dean and not realizing actually it's much better to be the professor than to be the dean. We tend to move ourselves out of purpose into these higher roles that are much harder to generate purpose in. The best, I think, example of the fact that purpose is not a luxury is Viktor Frankl. How many of you know Viktor Frankl? So he's one of the most sort of famous writers about meaning. And he found that it was purpose that enabled him to survive being a slave in a concentration camp during World War II. It was finding purpose every day as a slave. So I tend to think, unless your work environment is worse than being a slave in a concentration camp, there's really no excuse. It's really on you if he was able to do that. And it really points to the fact you don't have to have a yacht, you don't have to have a private plane, you don't even have to own a home to have purpose in your work. So the next question I looked at, sort of coming from my Taproot lens, trying to get my head around what is purpose actually, were these two scenarios. These are two women who have the exact same job, and the cartoonist added a cat, I'm not sure why. But even the cat is much happier in the second picture. So one is miserable and has no purpose. The other one has tremendous purpose. But they're doing the exact same job. It doesn't make any sense. It shouldn't be possible that two people in the exact same job, one experiences tremendous purpose, the other one doesn't. What's going on here, right? The second one is my man, Dr. Pickle, who is in Brooklyn. He's a local pickle merchant. He makes pickles and he sells pickles and he smells like pickles, right? This guy's job sucks, right? And he has so much purpose and is so happy. So my question was, what's wrong with him? How can this guy have purpose and happy, probably making not that much money, smelling like vinegar, and hawking pickles all day, right? Again, what's going on here? What do we actually understand about the science of purpose to understand why it is? This guy doesn't work at Google. Like, how could he be happy, right? So what the research really shows that there's three ways people look at work. And this is an important distinction I want to make sure is clear. It's not like every day. It has to do with someone interviewed you and said, what is the purpose of work itself, right? People tend to fall into one of three categories around how they have a mental construct in their head that they carry usually throughout their entire lives about what the role of work is, that largely comes out of their childhood and adolescence when it's formed. The first is job. I work so that I can afford to have a life outside of work. It's a necessary evil. And as someone said, these people tend to be coin-operated, right? They tend to be people who work is a necessary evil. They just do it for the money. It's an ability to generate resources, right? And that's the construct. What is work for? It pays the bills. The second one is career. These people tie work to ego. It's that they want to know, they tie it to their identity. Like when they go back to their high school reunion, they want to be able to say, I worked at Google, I am a doctor, I am whatever it is, and know that like they'll be thought of well. They want their mommy and daddy to be able to be proud of them, right? And that's the story. It's tied to identity. And the third is calling, which are people who fundamentally see work as something that adds value to the world. They see the act of work itself to be something of value and something of purpose and meaning. So the easiest way to understand this. Does that make sense? So what's fascinating about this is, first of all, the researchers find that those with calling have higher satisfaction with their lives and with their work, right? And on most regards, they're better employees. They're more loyal, they're more collaborative, ... So this is not necessarily like a diversity, oh, isn't it wonderful we have some people here that are like into jobs, some are into career, some are into calling. Calling is a better place to be as an individual and for a company to have employees that have of this mindset. What's fascinating is in the research they've done so far, in the United States, roughly a third of Americans see their work as a job, a third see it as a career, and a third see it as a calling, right? It breaks down roughly a third, a third, a third. But what's more interesting is that it doesn't really matter what the job is, right? So for doctors, roughly a third of doctors see it as a job. It's really good, regular pay, it pays well, it's stable, like I know I'm going to be set for life, like just being able to be a doctor. A third see it as a career. Mommy and daddy are so proud that I'm a doctor. When I go to a cocktail party, I'm a doctor. No one's going to be like, oh, sorry to hear that, right? Such a failure. And a third see it as a calling, that they actually see the act of medicine and doing the work as fundamental, like adding value to the world as the primary driver of what they do. But the same thing's true of this guy depicted here, who's an executive assistant. A third of executive assistants see work as a job, a third as a career, and a third as calling. So it's fascinating, and it leads only to like one strong conclusion, which is Purpose is a choice. If you can have the exact same job like those two women with the cat and have one that has tremendous purpose and one who doesn't, the only conclusion you can really draw is it's a choice, especially if it doesn't really depend what the career is, et cetera. I think that's an incredibly important thing to understand as individuals. As we tend to externalize our need for purpose, we tend to look for others to give us permission to have purpose, for others to hand us purpose, when in fact, the only conclusion you can really draw is that it's up to you. That doesn't mean certain jobs aren't better fit for you. Doesn't mean certain jobs don't give you more purpose than others. But at the end of the day, the core is whether or not you see work fundamentally is about adding value, and how do you optimize that? So what is purpose? Purpose is relationships. It's about working with other people. You can generate purpose on your own, but not for very long, right? Purpose is something that we get from working with other people, interacting with other people, serving other people. It's about doing something greater than yourself. But that doesn't mean it's a cause. You don't have to have a cause. It could just be helping a friend. It could be helping a coworker. It could be working on a product that makes a few people's lives a little bit easier. It doesn't have to be this grandiose vision. It's fundamentally just about doing something that's not just about you. And the third is personal growth and challenge, right? We get purpose when we grow, when we stretch, when we lean into our fear. That is something that generates purpose for us. These are the three things that generate purpose. And it was fascinating. We're doing this whole project around what's the next Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley's been the hub of the information economy, just like Detroit was for the industrial economy. And as Silicon Valley potentially becomes more like Detroit, another Silicon Valley will likely emerge around this new economy if you look at historic trending. So we've been going around the world helping cities think about how can you become this hub of the new economy. And last week we were in Dallas, and we went out and on the streets just interviewed 200 random people, taxi drivers, policemen, bankers across the board, and asked them, like, when was the last thing that you remember that you got purpose in your lives around, right? And this is sort of a warm-up exercise for the people involved in this conference we did. And it was fascinating just to hear everything fit into these three categories yet again. No matter what the diversity was, what part of the world they came from, purpose is driven and created out of these three things. So how do you act on this? How do you as an individual build purpose into your work, but also how do you as a company, organization, manager help others generate purpose? And I think this is an early day science. This is like the web back when I worked in technology in 1997, where it was just static images. This is like the early days. But here's what we understand about how to generate purpose for yourself. The first is all the research points to self-awareness as being the most critical first step. You need to understand what generates purpose for you, because not everyone gets purpose from the same things. And that's why the first thing we did at Imperative, my company, was create the first ever purpose diagnostic that in about 15 minutes can help you determine which of sort of 24 different purpose types you are, so you can start to actually become more self-aware about what actually generates purpose for you, because not everyone's the same. The second one is to craft your job around what gives you purpose. And I think Google's one of the great companies when it comes to this. Not to say it's perfect, it's never perfect, but I think you guys are often cited in this way, which is, and I'll talk more about this, but we often think about jobs like we do clothes, where you go and you just buy stuff off the rack. You don't necessarily tailor it to actually fit you well. I think same thing with jobs. We tend to take the job description, but we don't tailor it to actually fit us. We think of the job description as like the final product instead of the start of the conversation that needs to be tailored to meet our own individual purpose needs to make that work. The third is to connect personal purpose to organizational purpose. So we're working right now with a large company that has 10,000 new employees starting in September. And we're doing with them is making sure every employee, when they start at that company, has an understanding of what generates purpose for them, but then also a translation of their personal purpose into the organization's purpose, so they can understand how they're generating purpose at that organization and connect those dots, which is so critical to understand the context in which you work. The fourth is to celebrate and connect around purpose. Most companies celebrate the jobs mentality and the career mentality, right? Our company just made our quarterly earnings report. We just got featured in the New York Times. Like, these are the things that are about ego and resources. They're not about purpose. Cultures that actually celebrate the generation of purpose are much more likely to then build a culture and support people around purpose. We're also doing some incredible experimentation around the role of purpose in social networks. And what we've done internally is we asked people on our team to identify someone in our database who has the exact same purpose type as them, but has a job that they would never want and thinks sucks, right? Like, pick someone in there who's doing something that like you would never want to do. And shoot them an email and say, hey, can we get together and talk about what you do for a living? I'm really curious to hear how you generate purpose in that job. And two things consistently happen. The first is they become immediate BFFs. They're like, oh my God, me too, I totally love that, right? Because they're of the same purpose type, and they connect in a totally different level than they do with other people. The second thing we've heard almost always is, that sounds like such an awesome job, I would totally love to do that job. This is a job that they decided and they picked because they thought it would suck, right? And the reason this is one, our social networks today don't connect us based on the things that matter. They connect us around universities, they connect us around jobs, gender, ethnicity. They don't connect us on who we are as human beings, right? So our whole social networks are incredibly shallow. The second thing is we tend to get career advice from the wrong people. We get career advice from someone who's of a different purpose type, and they describe what that job is like for someone of their purpose type. They don't describe it from the perspective of someone who shares a purpose type and therefore looks at it through the same lens. So when we talk to our parents, coworkers, our parents' friends, someone we meet at a conference, we're getting it through the filter of how they find purpose, not how you find purpose. And therefore, it's incredibly misleading data, right? It's bad data. And that this is we're finding is an incredibly powerful way to change the way we do social networking. So I want to talk a little bit about this job crafting, which has been studied, again, by those 3 universities. And I think it's really important in understanding how work needs to change. And work is going to change. I mean, by the end of this decade, 40% of the workforce is going to be freelancers, 40%. The average job tenure now is 2 years. People are working in portfolio careers. Like, work is radically different than I knew it when I came out of college, and like insanely radically different than my parents. Job crafting to me is like the most promising sort of way of approaching this, and I mentioned it earlier, so I wanted to go through a little bit of the case study and what the researchers saw. This is a hospital orderly or cleaning person. Does anyone know anyone who's in that profession? Not one. So I can make up complete lies and none of you will know any different. Awesome. So this is one of the worst jobs out there for 2 reasons. You're literally cleaning up shit and you're treated like shit. So these people literally are having to clean up after dead bodies, people who've just thrown up everywhere, people who have like wounds. I mean, you're literally doing like fundamentally dirty work, right? Secondly, nurses and doctors, and in reading this research, like I came to tears several times, treat these people worse than any career I've ever heard in terms of treating them as subhuman, and that language is literally used, treating them like furniture, disrespecting them in so many different ways. And next time you're at a hospital watch, you'll see how they're not even thought of as human beings and how they're treated around the hospital. But again, 1/3 of these people roughly love their jobs and find them incredibly full of purpose. So the question became, what the hell is wrong with these people? How dare they like their jobs given how awful they are, right? What were they doing to make this viable, right? And what was interesting was, when the doctors and nurses weren't looking, they were singing to patients. They were dancing with patients. And many of them were telling jokes, right? Not part of their job description. They were crafting it in a different way. They described their work as important as doctors and nurses, and if you asked them, what's your job? They take care of patients. They don't see patients solely as someone to clean up after. They actually saw it that way, even though that was not part of their job description. And the most moving thing I read was, in a long-term care facility, they actually moved art around so that patients wouldn't have to look at the same art. They frequently were doing things way more than doctors or nurses to help people's family and friends connect with them and to help provide emotional support to them, because doctors and nurses were too busy and didn't care. They were often like the frontline social workers. They were the ones helping to provide connections for folks. They had made themselves into a vital part of the caring institution, not just someone who cleans up a mess, right? They had not changed their job. None of them stopped cleaning. None of them stopped doing their job. But they changed that 10 to 20% that fundamentally went from being a bad job into a great job because they crafted it, they tailored it to their needs and their need for purpose. They did this around 3 things. The tasks that they actually did, right? So it was not one of their tasks to sing. It was not in their job description. No one tested them when they took the job to see what jokes they could tell, right? Relationships. They changed fundamentally the relationship with the patient from someone who makes a mess to someone I care for. And they changed perception. Their job was not just cleaning. Their job was to be the human being that's connecting with these patients, because doctors and nurses were most often not acting like human beings, right? They had crafted the job to make it rich in purpose. And again, if they can do this in a job that's that dirty and that disrespected, again, there's very little excuse for how we can't, in any job we have in this room, figure out how we can do the equivalent of singing, dancing, and telling jokes, caring for families, moving art around. There's so much more we can do to optimize purpose. And I think this is the key for managers. It's the key for like the next generation of HR, is to try to help us all do that 10 to 20% crafting to really make it ours, instead of just taking a job description as off-the-rack clothing that just sort of kind of fits, right? I saw this happen somewhere that I least expected. I went into this company, Cornerstone Capital, in Midtown in New York, and it's all people wearing black suits, investment bankers, and I was like, finally, I found a place where there's no chance there's purpose in this place, right? There's no way, right? And I walk in the door, and like you could literally feel like waves of purpose like coming out of the office. And I was like, what the hell is going on here? This is not right. How dare there be purpose in Midtown, right? So I went and met with the CEO, and I asked her, like, what's going on? Like, your culture is insane. It's so awesome. These folks are like so incredible. Like, what is your secret recipe? And what I found out was that without technology, without academics, without anything, she had naturally, organically created a culture of job crafting, of exactly what I had just described. And she did it in a really simple but profound way. She asked people regularly, hey, how are you doing? How many of you ask that of other people? And how many of you actually mean it? So I'm one of those people who usually doesn't. I'm usually like, hey, what's up? It's like you're just in passing. Hey, what's going on? Or like, hey, good to see you, right? She actually like asks, and she really wants to know the answer. And if someone says, oh, I'm having a good day, she says, that's not good enough. You need to tell me what today made it a good day. What was that purpose moment? What was that moment that made it a good day, right? And she asks this over a couple of weeks or a month, and she starts to see patterns emerge. And based on that, she starts to change their jobs. She starts to find them projects that she knows would likely create those moments she saw. She crafts their jobs around who they are as human beings based on a process of job crafting in real time. And this is something that we can all do for each other, right? Just by asking each other, how was your day? And asking for moments that matter to them and helping them recognize moments of purpose and finding ways when we come across a project to say, hey, that looks like a great project for this person because I know these are the kind of things that are going to generate purpose for them. You don't have to be a CEO. You don't even have to be the manager. You can do this for coworkers by simply helping them become aware of what's generating purpose for them and helping push them and helping them get to access and these other things. My point of view and what I've seen and been heard reinforced as I've traveled across the world talking about this book and the work of Imperative is that the purpose economy is coming. In the next 10 to 20 years, we're likely to see a major shift in every industry. We're already seeing it in retail, finance, healthcare. We're seeing radical changes that are all around humanizing industry again, bringing it back to purpose. And there's really two choices you have. You can bust out an umbrella, or you can bust out a surfboard. And if you bust out a surfboard, you have a much greater chance of not only surviving, but also having a great time in the process. And that's my core message, which is this change is happening. How can you anticipate it, grab your surfboard and enjoy it and make the most of it? Because I think it's going to be an incredibly thrilling time. It's going to be a time of great innovation, and innovation that's fundamentally about our needs as human beings. And just really, I think it's interesting as Google, because you guys are, the 800-pound gorilla in the information economy right now, to think about how does this company continue to thrive that way, but at the same time prepare for the next economy and not do what Detroit did, which was assume that what got them there was going to be what keeps them there, right? That was Detroit's hubris. And the question is, will Silicon Valley have the same hubris of thinking the information economy is the last stop on the train, or will they fundamentally see whether or not this is just one step and a need to constantly evolve and not just rest on what worked in the past? So with that, I want to open it up for discussion. I also wanted to share my email address. It's really important to me to always be accessible. As you saw in writing my book, all the work I do is done by a community, and I'm really excited to have you guys as part of that community, helping to identify, as Court said, these different trends that are going on and opportunities in this new economy so that we can really together build an economy that's built for human beings. So with that, if there's any questions, would love to open it up.
So the purpose diagnostic you mentioned, is that available to the public? Anyone can go on your site and take it?
Yeah, it's a free tool that we built on the website. is sort of our sort of first step in the building out of our platform, which is really going to be about helping you discover purpose and then connect to people, jobs, opportunities, projects that'll generate purpose for you based on who you are.
Okay, great. That's
Yeah.
terrific.
So yeah, check it out. The price is right. Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned like the three different areas, whether it's calling or
Yeah.
career, and you said something like it's kind of instilled early on in how you're raised. Do you have any like best tactics to maybe fight against if you think you might have been raised one way, or your parents were kind of on one side, but you feel like the calling purpose is really what's going to elevate how you do your daily work and everything?
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot of research on like how to actually shift it once it's set in your adolescence. So I think the first thing I would say is anyone a parent in this room? Anyone aspiring to be a parent at some point in their lives? I think it's so important as a parent to understand what role you play in imprinting this on your kids, especially in their adolescence, around how do you model for them. It doesn't have to be what you actually do, but it's what they perceive, right? So even if you like deep down really artist job, but you recognize for your kids it'd be better to be calling, see if you can trick them. It's better to have them, they need to perceive you as thinking about work as something that adds value, and not practicing coming home from work complaining about work and how awful it is. Instead, bringing home the questions and seeing work as like an integrated part of your life. So that's the most important thing, is just to be parents who model this the right way. I think if you haven't been raised that way and you're trying to figure out like how do you change that, my sense of it from what I've read is that the first step is you have to let go of that story, because we each walk around with stories that make our life workable. They're the things that help explain our behavior, explain the way the world works, and it's incredibly scary to let go of those things, because those are the things that make us feel comfortable operating in the world. So before you can build like a new perspective, you have to some degree let go and tear down that old model, and that's a really hard and scary thing to do. And I think it's probably something that requires something like a boot camp, to like get yourself to just let go of that and to feel like you're still okay, naked without that story. And then starting to like become self-aware, I think the best practice is just daily journaling of nothing longer than a tweet, like just a sentence or two of like what was a moment today that brought you purpose, and starting to build self-awareness about the fact that purpose is in your job already. It's all around you, but you have to build up an appreciation, a consciousness of it, and not just take that all for granted. We had someone take this purpose diagnostic on our site, and they emailed us and said, shit, I just quit my job, and I just realized after taking this diagnostic, I shouldn't have quit my job. I was getting so much purpose, but I was taking it for granted and just assumed you could get that in any job. And I realize now how much I love the people I worked with, how I was doing something greater than myself, and how much opportunity I had for growth. But I just sort of was always, like the grass was always greener. So it's so important just to take stock of what you already have.
So it sounds really great if the purpose economy is coming, but why do you have such a rosy forecast for the future? Because there's plenty of kind of cynicism and dehumanization in the world and in all the future forecasts.
Yep.
So why are you so optimistic that will change?
I'm an optimist, so I'll start with that. Like if this was AA, I'd be like, my name is Aaron and I'm an optimist. I have found that, first of all, optimism tends to breed results, whereas pessimism doesn't. So in building this case, building the story, building a community of people around it, it's infinitely more likely to happen. So first of all. I think second of all is I look at, again, healthcare, I look at finance, I look at retail, I look at education, and I look at where the innovation's happening. And there's a lot of things we have to overcome, but I look at where the innovation is, there's a lot of reason for hope. I think there's a lot of trends that are happening around the world around this that point to purpose and point to these innovations as what's happening. And I see in the millennial generation the greatest reason for hope. I think the millennial generation values purpose more than any previous generation because, again, it's a generation that's about relationships, it's about doing something greater than themselves, and it's about personal growth. So I feel like with this generation, there's so much reason for hope and to clean up so many of the messes that have been made by previous generations, to be candid. And I think that generation in and of itself is probably the one that gives me the greatest hope for this. And I think, I'm a Jewish New Yorker. Like I can paint you like a really horrible picture of the world, and I can right now tell you a perfect case for why I don't even think the human race will be here in 5 years. If you wanted to go down that path and like think about like doomsday scenario, but I think there's a lot more reason for optimism than pessimism right now. And every time I meet with a millennial, and every time I meet with one of these companies or nonprofits or governments that's innovating in this space, it's hard to not walk away incredibly optimistic.
So is this sort of another way of saying, like, purpose-driven people and companies outcompete other people and companies, and so they're going to gain, market mind share in the world
Yeah,
over the next year?
so this is what I think will happen. I think I'm already seeing this in the data. Like from a workforce point of view, employers that aren't able to provide purpose to their employees and individual employees who are not purpose-oriented are going to find that the market is not as responsive to them. So it is going to become economically in your best interest to be purpose-driven as an individual and as an organization to be able to create the place those people want to work. Because it's going to be increasingly obvious those are the people you want in your company. So that's sort of one, which goes to that data. I think the second one, which is more immediate, is, and you see that, by the way, like all the major consulting firms now, they lead almost entirely with purpose as what they're selling. And in fact, like their big conferences around marketing purpose. Like that's what consulting firms are now having to sell to get the best talent into their firms, and not just about pro bono. But I think the other big piece is around retail, right? And you see what's happening with retail and the fundamental shifts. And you see that in the maker economy, you see it in the sharing economy, across all these different innovations. More and more of these industries are being disrupted by disintermediated, purpose-oriented businesses. And that's going to also create that change. So you have it both from the workplace and from a retail perspective, seeing that change. Is it guaranteed? No. I would guarantee that there will be another economy after this one. I think it's going to be purpose. I, again, like very sincerely say to a group of very smart people, think about it and tell me what you think the next economy is, if you think it's something else. So.
Do you see this as a U.S. phenomenon or global? Or how is it in different countries?
Good to see you. I've experienced it globally as I've traveled around the world. I haven't traveled to every country. I haven't even traveled to every state. I think it'll evolve in different ways. And I'm struggling somewhat, honestly, with this question because sort of one narrative is like each country and culture has to go through this rise from agrarian, industrial, information, purpose, right? And there's some economies that are still agrarian, right? So you could just say from an innovation curve standpoint, they're going to have to go through those different steps, right? To be able to get to the point where their economy is fundamentally driven by purpose, they're going to need to have the industrial infrastructure, then the information economy infrastructure, then they'll get there. But even throughout that, I think we'll still see a lot of, and I've already seen, like in China, I've seen it throughout Europe, purpose economy businesses disrupting the marketplace, right? And seeing, I mean, China is one of the most fascinating examples because there you've got an incredible challenge. When I was talking to business students there around, at one hand, they've got capitalism, right? An incredible excitement of capitalism. But they've all were raised on a belief in the collective good and trying to figure out how to reconcile those two things and looking to the US for examples largely in Europe of like how do you create businesses, how do you create approaches that can reconcile those two sets of beliefs. And I think a lot of the ideas behind this really resonate with sort of the next generation of entrepreneurs in China around how do we create things that both represent the old values of China and the new values of China. The piece I struggle with is I think purpose is universal, and I think obviously people experience purpose in every culture, every country, no matter what the poverty is, what the economic reality is. But I think in terms of being an economic driver, I don't think it likely will emerge as dominant until countries have gone through these other economic stages.
I'm wondering if you can talk more about guidance you would give to parents in the room. And then the other question I have is, can you cite some examples of this where it's happening? I mean, I can think of a few like Teach for America, NGOs, and other things like this. Examples where people are, even open source software is, I think, another one. So guidance for parents of young kids and more examples, please.
So I'll start with the parents piece, right? And I'll tell you a little bit about what I do is that's sort of the best example. I don't like to give advice I don't take myself because that's cheap. I think one is just the way you talk to your kids about work and the role of work in your life is really important. That's why actually the last time I was here when my kids' book came out, Mommy and Daddy Do It Pro Bono, which I wrote with my wife, which is all about like the impact of work in different professions, right? And I just find it so important to talk to our kids about why we work, why is it we're away from them for 50 hours a week, what are we doing, what value are we creating, and it's also really important to bring your kids to work regularly. So I think that's another thing that the research has started pointing to is how important it is for them not to see work as this black box that you go to, but actually be able to relate to and understand work as a real thing with real people and understand why you love it and enjoy it and why you work, right? The other thing I would say, which I do as best I can, but the research, actually one of your Googlers actually was the key researcher on this when she was at Michigan, really points to the fact that mothers matter a whole hell of a lot more than fathers when it comes to this imprinting. And they haven't done research yet on same-sex couples. They haven't done it on single parents. But in the context of like a quote-unquote traditional family, if you have a good relationship with your mother, there's almost no chance you will grow up with a jobs orientation. In their research, I don't believe they didn't find a single person who had a jobs mentality, who saw work only as about money, who also had a good relationship with their mother. Which is pretty interesting, right? So there's clearly something about the role of mothers in a family setting that's incredibly important. And I think and I've written a lot about this, just how important it is for workplaces to really embrace mothers bringing their kids to work. And traditionally what I've seen for myself is when I bring my kids to work, or I bring them on speaking tours like this, which I do as often as I can, everyone's like, that's so awesome, like you love your kids, you're incorporating them into work, it's so great to see a dad doing that. But if my wife did the same thing, it would more likely be a story of like, why can't you get your act together? Why can't you control your kids? Why do you need to bring your kids to work? Couldn't you find childcare? We tend to have a double standard around people bringing kids to work. So I think it's really important to like embrace and encourage mothers to bring their kids to work. And then what was the second question was around, examples. So, I think in real estate, seeing like the rise of shared office space, like in New York now, there's so many shared office spaces where people are working as freelancers amongst each other in these more collective environments instead of just being like a monolithic corporate cultures. And you see sort of this whole sharing economy overall hitting workspace in a big way. And I saw that all around Europe as well. In retail, you see companies like Etsy that are enabling individual makers to find a market for their goods. I just did a call the other day with IKEA. And IKEA actually runs whole malls in Europe and in Asia, not just the standalone stores. And they're trying to figure out, what does a shopping mall in the purpose economy look like? And sort of seeing it as this mashup between like an IKEA and an Etsy studio, like in one place, you're actually environments for makers. And that's really sort of like how a lot of these large developers are thinking about the shopping malls of the future, is that they're actually like places where you're making, not just buying, right? So that's a fundamental shift. In healthcare, you look at Kaiser Permanente, which is one of the biggest healthcare providers. They're trying to return to an old model, which is it used to be, and I think this was like thousands of years ago, but even like 50 years ago, the majority of times you saw a doctor were in your home. They came to you, which right now sounds freaking crazy, right? Like that would never happen. But if you think about it rationally, who's the sick one? You or the doctor. Like, do you ask the sick person to get out of bed or the healthy person to get out of bed, right? We go and like spend a bunch of time when we're sick getting out of bed, getting to a hospital room or a doctor's room full of other sick people to see a doctor for a few minutes. It's not the right model. We need to have it fundamentally where when you're sick or you need attention, it comes to you. And Kaiser's made it their 10-year goal to flip that whole model on its head to make relationship-based, human-centered healthcare the norm in its model, right? So that's sort of another example. So you see this, in education you see a major shift towards customized, personalized education and away from an industrial education model, right? More people today in the US, or the fastest growing segment of the US educational population right now is homeschooling. Not because homeschooling is the model, but because people are realizing they need to be able to customize education, and homeschooling is producing much better results than classrooms, right? We're starting to see where we can actually like innovate to make this work. Those are some examples. I can go on forever, but. Yep.
Aaron,
what's up?
First off, thank you for the talk. It was really
of course.
inspiring and eye-opening. But I had a question about can purpose change, or what are your views on purpose as an individual and from a cultural perspective? And if so, how would we adapt to that?
In terms of what generates purpose for us individually? So I have not seen a longitudinal like study overall of that question. I can only speak to like having worked with thousands of professionals at Taproot and other places. And I have never seen it change. What I've seen is people becoming more and more self-aware. So they start off with thinking purpose is here, but as they work in the world and become more self-aware, they start to peel layers of the onion, getting closer and closer to who they are at their core. So that's what I've seen. So when people say they've changed what generates purpose for them, it usually, I should say, every time I've seen it, it's actually been a manifestation of them simply becoming more self-aware and more awake. And not just taking what they see from their friends. Like most of like younger people early in their career, what their sense of purpose comes from, they often perceive it as being about like what they see on the web, what they see on TV, what they read, what their friends are doing. Like everyone's into water all of a sudden and they think that's what's like purpose for them. It's much more of a social construct. And I think as you get older, you start to like get rid of those things and start realizing who you actually are, not what your social environment says you are. And therefore it appears to change, but actually you're just becoming more self-aware.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's just a very interesting fundamental concept that you said, job, career, and calling. I just wonder whether you have historical data to show in the past that this mix changes over time. Are we at a low point of calling, or are we at a high point of calling? Just
Yeah, no, it's a great
project
question.
for the future.
So all this research is so new. So your question would be like, how fast was the internet in the 1960s? It wasn't, right? So I think the challenge is this research is so new, there hasn't been a longitudinal look at like 10, 20, 30 years ago. And it's also been US centric, right? So I mean, one of the areas where I would love to see additional research investment is in longitudinal, but then also going and seeing in different countries, how does this change with different cultures, right? To see how that plays out. And across different generations, like do boomers tend to have a different distribution than Gen X or millennials, right? This again is like, we're just at the like tip of this research, right? There's so many awesome questions, which is a perfect time for somebody like me to get involved because you can still look smart asking really simple basic questions because we're not yet at those like little minutia questions where we are with a lot of other places. You can still ask really simple questions and no one's answered them, and it's a chance to go out there and really make an impact. So keep on asking the question, and I know Google does a lot of great research on work and has like, you know, the largest, most robust team looking at the analytics and research of work. I think these are the questions that we collectively need to answer.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Yeah, thank
Great
you.
speech.
That was great. Thank you, guys.